Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, we're going to travel together through time, exploring the remarkable story of Colorado, a place where mountains touch the sky, and human history stretches back thousands of years. This is a land of towering peaks and endless plains, of ancient civilizations and modern dreams. And its story is far more fascinating than you might imagine. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey together. Back to a time long before Colorado had a name. Back to when massive ice sheets covered much of North America and the first humans set foot in this magnificent landscape. Before we start, I'd love to know something. If you actually live in the USA, which state are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Perhaps you actually live in Colorado, and the history of your home state has significant meaning for your life. Maybe you've even come across artifacts from ancient times, or stories passed down through generations that connect you more deeply to the land. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Imagine, if you will, the world as it existed more than 13,000 years ago. The climate was dramatically different from what we know today. Enormous glaciers carved through valleys, creating the dramatic landscapes we see in the Rockies. The air was colder, the seasons more extreme, and roaming across these lands were creatures that seem almost mythical to us now. Woolly mammoths, their thick fur protecting them from the bitter cold, moved in great herds. Giant ground sloths, some standing over 10 feet tall, foraged among the vegetation. Ancient bison, larger than their modern descendants, thundered across the plains, and hunting these magnificent beasts were people. The very first Coloradans, though they would never have called themselves that, their main weapon was a spear, but not just any spear. These early hunters created sophisticated stone points, carefully chipped and shaped with extraordinary precision. The most famous of these are called Clovis points, named after the town in New Mexico where they were first discovered. These points, usually about 4 to 5 inches long, featured a distinctive channel or flute running up from the base. This wasn't just for decoration. The flute allowed the point to be more securely attached to a wooden shaft, creating a deadly efficient hunting weapon. Making one of these points required immense skill. A single mistake could ruin hours of careful work. The Napa, as these craftspeople are called, had to understand the stone intimately, knowing exactly where and how hard to strike to remove just the right flake. These Paleo-Indians, as archaeologists call them, were remarkably skilled survivors. They had crossed from Asia into North America, following game animals across the land bridge that once connected the continents. Over generations, they moved southward, adapting to new environments, learning the rhythms of unfamiliar lands. When they reached what we now call Colorado, they found a hunter's paradise, a place rich with game and resources. Now, you might wonder how we know so much about people who lived so long ago, who left no written records, no buildings of stone or brick. The answer lies in the places they left behind, sites scattered across Colorado that preserve glimpses of their lives. One of the most significant is the Lindenmeyer site, located in northern Colorado near the Wyoming border. Discovered in the 1920s, this site has yielded thousands of artifacts, tools made from stone and bone, the remains of ancient meals, evidence of a camp that was used repeatedly over many years. What makes Lindenmeyer so special is what it tells us about these early people's lives. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had sophisticated knowledge of their environment, understanding which plants were edible, when certain animals would migrate through the area, where to find the best stone for making tools. They created beautiful objects, not just functional tools, but items that suggest an aesthetic sense. A desire to make things that were pleasing to look at, not just useful. Some of the bone tools found at Lindenmeyer are decorated with careful engraving, patterns that may have held meaning we can never fully understand. The landscape these people inhabited was changing constantly. As the Ice Age gradually ended, the climate warmed, glaciers retreated, and the giant Ice Age animals began to disappear. Whether humans played a role in their extinction remains a matter of debate among scientists. Some argue that hunting pressure from humans was a significant factor. Others point to the dramatic climate changes, the loss of the specific plants these animals depended on. Most likely, it was a combination of both. Whatever the cause, by about 10,000 years ago, the mammoths and giant sloths were gone, and the people of Colorado had to adapt. And adapt they did, remarkably so. Over the following millennia, the inhabitants of Colorado developed increasingly sophisticated ways of living. Instead of focusing primarily on hunting large game, they diversified their food sources. They became expert gatherers, learning which roots, seeds, nuts, and berries were nutritious and when to harvest them. They hunted smaller game, rabbits, deer, pronghorn, antelope. They developed new hunting techniques, including the otlaughtal, a spear-throwing device that dramatically increased the range and power of their weapons. The people of this era, known as the Archaic period, which lasted for thousands of years, left their mark across Colorado in subtle but fascinating ways. They created rock art, pecking and scratching images into stone surfaces, a practice archaeologists call petroglyph making, or painting on rock faces with mineral pigments, creating what we call these images, spirals, geometric patterns, animal figures, human-like forms, are scattered across the state. Some are clearly representational, depicting bighorn sheep or deer with careful attention to detail. Others are more abstract patterns, whose meanings remain mysterious to us. Around 8,000 years ago, we see evidence of people using natural features of the landscape in clever ways. Game drive systems appeared, where hunters would funnel animals toward cliffs or natural traps. These weren't random acts, but carefully planned community efforts that required coordination, planning, and intimate knowledge of animal behavior. Families and bands would work together, some acting as beaters to move the animals, others waiting at the kill site. After a successful hunt, there would be a feast, a time of plenty, and the work of processing the meat, preserving what couldn't be eaten immediately, using every part of the animal, bones for tools, hides for clothing and shelter. Were these images religious or spiritual in nature? Were they recording important events, marking territory, or perhaps teaching younger generations about hunting techniques? We can speculate, but we must remain humble in our interpretations. The people who made these images left no written explanation, and their descendants' oral traditions, where they survive, sometimes offer insights, but often raise new questions. What we do know is that these images were important enough that people returned to certain sites repeatedly over centuries, adding new images, perhaps refreshing old ones, maintaining a connection to these sacred or significant places. Storage became increasingly important. Instead of moving constantly, some groups began staying in certain areas for longer periods, especially in places where resources were reliably abundant. They dug storage pits, lined them to protect their contents from moisture and pests, and cached food for leaner times. This ability to store food meant they could support larger populations in one place, and it set the stage for a remarkable transformation that would occur in southwestern Colorado. As we move forward in time into what archaeologists call the late Archaic period, roughly for 2,000 years ago, we see increasingly sophisticated technologies emerging. People began experimenting with plant cultivation, though they remained primarily hunters and gatherers. They developed better methods for grinding seeds and nuts, creating milling stones and grinding slabs that allowed them to process harder foods more efficiently. They improved their basket-making techniques, creating containers so tightly woven they could hold water. Some of these baskets, preserved in dry cave sites, survive today, testaments to the incredible skill of their makers. Around 2,000 years ago, these people were living in pit houses, structures partially built into the ground with roofs at ground level. These homes were remarkably well suited to the environment. The earth provided insulation, keeping homes cooler in a scorching summer and warmer during the cold winter months. Families would enter through the roof, climbing down a ladder into the single room where they cooked, ate, worked, and slept. A fire pit in the center provided warmth and a place to prepare food, while a ventilation shaft brought in fresh air. In the region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, a region archaeologists call the Four Corners, something extraordinary was happening. The people there were developing a way of life that would eventually produce some of the most impressive archaeological sites in North America. These were the Ancestral Pueblo, though you might have heard them called by their older name, the Anasazi, a Navajo word. Today, most archaeologists prefer Ancestral Pueblones because it more accurately reflects their connection to modern Pueblo peoples. But what truly set the Ancestral Pueblones apart was their increasing reliance on agriculture. While people in other parts of Colorado continued to depend primarily on hunting and gathering, the Ancestral Pueblo were becoming farmers. Corn, originally domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier, had gradually spread northward. In the Four Corners region, people learned to cultivate it successfully despite the challenging conditions. The short growing season, the unpredictable rainfall, the poor soil in many areas. Growing corn reliably in this environment required innovation and persistence. The Ancestral Pueblones developed specialized planting techniques, placing seeds deep in moist soil, where they would be protected during dry spells. They built small dams and irrigation channels to direct precious water to their fields. They learned to save seeds from plants that performed well in their specific conditions, gradually developing varieties better adapted to the high elevation and dry climate. Corn wasn't their only crop. They also grew beans and squash, three crops that worked beautifully together. The corn stalks provided support for the climbing bean vines. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for the other plants, and the squash leaves spread across the ground, shading the soil, reducing evaporation and discouraging weeds. As their agricultural practices improved and became more reliable, populations grew and settlements became larger and more permanent. The pit houses began to give way to surface structures, and around 750 CE, we see the beginning of truly impressive architectural achievements. Using sandstone, the ancestral Pueblones began building multi-room structures, pueblos, from which the people derived their name. These weren't simple buildings, but carefully planned complexes that could house many families. The construction of these pueblos required enormous effort and sophisticated knowledge. Sandstone doesn't come in convenient blocks. It had to be quarried, shaped, and transported, sometimes over considerable distances. The builders learned to select stones carefully, understanding how different types of sandstone would weather and hold up over time. They created mortar from mud, mixed with water, and sometimes other materials like ash or plant fibers. The walls were thick, providing excellent insulation, and many rooms had no ground-level entrance, accessible only through the roof or from another room, perhaps for security or maybe just because it made structural sense. The design of kivas connects to deep spiritual beliefs. The ancestral Pueblones, like their modern descendants, had complex religious beliefs involving multiple worlds, sacred directions, and the fundamental importance of maintaining balance and harmony. The kiva was a connection to that spiritual world, a sacred space where the boundaries between the everyday and the sacred became thin. Inside these pueblos, rooms served different purposes. Some were living quarters, others were for storage, keeping precious corn, beans, dried meat, and seeds safe from weather and pests. Still other rooms were for specialized activities. Some contained milling stones for grinding corn into flour, a task that would have occupied many hours of a woman's day. The repetitive motion of grinding, pushing the stone back and forth over the grain, was physically demanding, and archaeologists can actually identify female skeletons from ancestral Puebloan sites by the distinctive wear patterns on their bones, evidence of thousands of hours spent preparing food. But perhaps the most distinctive spaces in these pueblos were the kivas, circular or semicircular chambers that were partially or wholly underground. These weren't living spaces, but ceremonial rooms, places for religious rituals, community gatherings, and possibly for meetings where important decisions were made. Kivas typically featured a fire pit in the center, a ventilation shaft, and a small hole in the floor called a pew, representing the place where, according to Pueblo traditions, humans emerged into this world from a previous world below. These cliff dwellings are breathtaking both for their beauty and for the sheer audacity of building entire villages in such challenging locations. Imagine standing at the bottom of a canyon, looking up at the sheer sandstone walls, and seeing tucked into a massive alcove hundreds of feet above you, an entire village, stone walls, towers, hundreds of rooms, all perfectly fitted into the natural shelter of the rock overhang. By around 1100 CE, the ancestral Puebloan culture had reached its peak in terms of architectural achievement and population. Settlements grew larger and more complex, and nowhere is this more evident than at Mesa Verde, the most famous ancestral Puebloan site in Colorado, and one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. Mesa Verde, which means green table in Spanish, is a massive plateau in southwestern Colorado that rises dramatically above the surrounding valleys. For centuries, the ancestral Pueblones built their homes on top of this mesa, taking advantage of the flatland for agriculture and construction. But in the 1200s, something changed. The people began building in a new location, not on top of the mesa, but in the alcoves and caves in the cliff faces below the rim. The most famous of these cliff dwellings is Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America. It contains about 150 rooms and 23 kivas, and at its peak, it may have housed around 100 people. The walls are beautifully constructed, multiple stories high in places, with wooden beams supporting upper floors and roof structures. Many rooms still have the original plaster on the walls, sometimes showing evidence of paint or decoration. The kivas are remarkably preserved, their circular forms fitting perfectly into the available space. Yet living in these cliff dwellings also came with significant challenges. Access was difficult, requiring ladders or hand and toe holes carved into the rock face. Carrying water, food, and materials up and down daily would have been exhausting. The rooms were often dark, natural light entering only through doorways and small openings. So the decision to build in the cliffs must have been motivated by powerful reasons, factors that made the difficulties worthwhile. But why did the Ancestral Pueblo move to these cliff dwellings? This question has puzzled archaeologists for decades. The cliff locations offered some advantages. They were protected from the elements, the overhanging rock keeping off rain and snow. They were easy to defend, though evidence of widespread warfare during this period is limited. Perhaps most importantly, building in the cliffs freed up the mesa top for agriculture. Every available inch of flat land could be used for growing crops. Life in these cliff dwellings required cooperation and social organization. Water had to be carried up from springs in the canyon below. Crops had to be tended on the mesa top, and the harvest brought down to the storage rooms in the cliffs. Building and maintaining the structures required coordinating the work of many people. This wasn't a society of isolated families, but a genuine community with shared goals and responsibilities. They also created beautiful baskets, jewelry from shells and turquoise, and cotton textiles. Yes, cotton. They grew cotton in small garden plots and wove it into cloth using looms. They made sandals from yucca fibers so well constructed that they could withstand the rough terrain. They carved stone into tools, both practical implements and objects whose purpose we can only guess at. Perhaps ceremonial items, or simply beautiful things made for the joy of creation. The Ancestral Pueblo were also skilled artisans. They created beautiful pottery using local clays and mineral pigments to create distinctive black-on-white designs. These weren't just utilitarian objects, but works of art decorated with complex geometric patterns, spirals, zigzags, and other motifs. Each potter had their own style, and archaeologists can sometimes identify individual artists by their distinctive techniques and patterns. These pottery vessels were used for cooking, for storing food and water, and also in ceremonies. When someone died, pottery vessels were often included in their burial, perhaps containing food or water for their journey to the afterlife. Trade was an important part of Ancestral Puebloan life. Macaw feathers from birds native to Mexico and Central America have been found at Mesa Verde. Evidence of trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles. Shells from the Pacific coast, turquoise from distant mines, obsidian from volcanic sources. All of these materials found their way to the Four Corners region through complex exchange systems. The Ancestral Puebloans weren't isolated, but connected to a vast web of trade and cultural exchange. Several factors came together to make life in the Four Corners region increasingly difficult. A severe drought struck the region in the late 1200s, a period called the Great Drought. Tree ring studies, which allow scientists to reconstruct past climate with remarkable precision, show that rainfall during this period was far below normal year after year. For farmers depending on rain-fed agriculture, this would have been catastrophic. Crops would have failed, stored food supplies would have dwindled, and starvation would have become a real threat. Then, in the late 1200s, something dramatic happened. The Ancestral Pueblo began to leave their cliff dwellings and mesatop pueblos. Within a few decades, Mesa Verde and most of the Four Corners region were abandoned. This departure has been called one of the great mysteries of American archaeology, though recent research has helped us understand what happened, even if questions remain. But the drought wasn't the only problem. By the 1200s, the Ancestral Puebloans had been intensively farming the mesa tops for centuries. The soil was depleted, less productive than it had been generations earlier. They had also cut down most of the large trees in the area, wood being essential for construction and for fuel. Without forest cover, soil erosion would have worsened, and the land's ability to retain moisture would have decreased. The environment they depended on had been fundamentally altered by their presence. There's also evidence of social stress during this period. Some sites show signs of violence, bodies buried hastily without the usual care, evidence of malnutrition, suggesting that as resources became scarce, social tensions increased. The cooperative systems that had allowed these communities to thrive may have begun to break down under the stress of prolonged hardship. So the people left, but they didn't vanish. This is important to understand. The Ancestral Puebloans didn't mysteriously disappear. They migrated, moving to areas where conditions were more favorable. Many went south and east to the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, where rivers provided more reliable water sources. Others moved to other areas where farming was still viable. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi Zuni, and the various Rio Grande Pueblo communities. These peoples maintain strong cultural and spiritual connections to Mesa Verde and other ancestral Puebloan sites. which they regard as the homes of their ancestors, sacred places that are part of their heritage and history. While this remarkable civilization was flourishing and then dispersing in southwestern Colorado, other peoples were making their homes in different parts of the region: the high mountains, the eastern plains, the western plateaus. Each environment supported different ways of life. Different cultures adapted to their specific landscapes. The Utes lived in small family groups for much of the year, but would gather in larger numbers at certain times and places. Summers often brought multiple bands together in mountain parks and valleys, where game was plentiful and the weather pleasant. These gatherings were important social events, times for young people to meet potential spouses, for elders to share knowledge and stories, for trading, and for ceremonial activities. In the mountains and western plateaus, the Ute people had lived for centuries. The Utes were hunters and gatherers who moved seasonally, following game animals and plant resources. Their deep knowledge of the mountain environment allowed them to thrive in what might seem to outsiders a harsh and unforgiving landscape. They knew where to find game in each season, which high mountain meadows would provide the best roots and berries, where to set up temporary camps that offered shelter from storms. The arrival of horses, which reached the region in the late 1600s and early 1700s, transformed Ute life dramatically. Horses had escaped or been traded from Spanish settlements to the south, and native peoples quickly recognized their value. Horses made travel faster and easier, allowing the Utes to cover much larger territories. They made hunting more efficient, particularly for buffalo, which required following the herds across long distances. Horses also became a form of wealth and a symbol of status. A man with many horses was respected, and horses were given as gifts, used in trade, and prized possessions. On the eastern plains of Colorado, different peoples made their homes. The vast grasslands, what early American explorers would call the Great American Desert, though it was far from a desert, supported enormous herds of buffalo, and buffalo meant life for the plains peoples. The Arapaho and Cheyenne, who would become major presences on Colorado's plains, were relative newcomers to the region. Originally from the Great Lakes area and the upper Missouri River region, they had gradually moved westward, pushed by conflicts with other tribes and by the disruption caused by European contact and trade in the east. With horses, the Utes became more mobile and powerful. They ranged across a vast territory from the mountains of central Colorado west into Utah and south into New Mexico. They traded with other tribes and with Spanish settlers, exchanging buffalo hides and other goods for metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured items. They also engaged in raids, sometimes acquiring horses and other goods from neighboring peoples. This was a pattern common across the plains and mountain west. A complex system of trade, alliance, and conflict that existed long before American expansion into the region. The Cheyenne had once been farmers living in permanent villages along rivers in what is now Minnesota and the Dakotas. But as they moved west onto the plains and acquired horses, they became buffalo hunters, adopting the nomadic lifestyle of the plains peoples. The Arapaho had a similar trajectory, transforming from a more settled existence to life as mounted buffalo hunters. The buffalo hunt was the central activity around which much of plains life revolved. Successful hunting required cooperation, planning, and considerable skill. Hunters would scout the herds, determining their location and movement. When conditions were right, the hunt would begin. Before horses, this often involved elaborate strategies, driving buffalo over cliffs or into corrals. With horses, hunters could ride alongside the massive beasts, loosing arrows at close range, a dangerous practice that required exceptional horsemanship and courage. Buffalo were everything to plains peoples. From a single buffalo, a family could obtain hundreds of pounds of meat, which could be dried and preserved for months. The hide provided material for tipi covers, clothing, robes for warmth, and could be made into bags, shields, and countless other items. Bones became tools and implements. Sinew, the tough connective tissue, was used as thread and for making bowstrings. Horns became cups and spoons. Even the buffalo's stomach could be used as a cooking vessel. Every part of the animal had a use, and nothing was wasted. After the hunt came the processing, and this was primarily women's work. It was exhausting, skilled labor that could take days for a large kill. Hides had to be carefully removed, then scraped clean of fat and tissue, a process that required hours of strenuous work. The meat had to be butchered, cut into strips, and dried or smoked. Some meat would be made into pemmican, a nutritious concentrated food made by pounding dried meat into a powder and mixing it with fat and sometimes berries. Properly prepared, pemmican could last for years, making it ideal for trade or for sustaining the group during winter months when hunting was difficult. Plains societies, despite their nomadic nature, had complex social structures and rich ceremonial lives. The sun dance, a major religious ceremony practiced by many plains peoples, was an elaborate ritual lasting several days, involving fasting, dancing, and sometimes painful physical trials. These weren't acts of primitive savagery, but deeply meaningful spiritual practices, ways of seeking visions, giving thanks, and renewing the relationship between the people and the sacred powers that govern their world. Plains life was mobile by necessity. Following the buffalo herds meant moving camp frequently, and the tipi was perfectly designed for this lifestyle. Made from buffalo hides, sewn together and stretched over a frame of long poles. A tipi could be erected or taken down in less than an hour by experienced hands. Despite its simplicity, the tipi was remarkably efficient. The conical shape shed rain and snow, resisted wind, and the smoke flap at the top, which could be adjusted with poles, created an effective ventilation system that drew smoke from the central fire upward and out. In summer, the sides could be lifted to allow cooling breezes through. In winter, a liner was added inside, creating an insulating airspace that made the tipi surprisingly warm and comfortable. Leadership among plains peoples was generally earned rather than inherited. A man might become a chief or leader through demonstrated courage in war, wisdom in council, generosity, and success in hunting. Chiefs led through persuasion and example, rather than through coercive power. If people disagreed with the chief's decisions, they could simply refuse to follow, or could leave and join another band. This system placed a premium on leadership qualities, and kept leaders accountable to their people. The Comanche, though they ranged primarily south of Colorado, in what would become Texas and Oklahoma, also had a significant presence in southeastern Colorado. The Comanche were feared warriors, masters of mounted warfare, who created an empire across the southern plains. Their raids reached deep into Mexico, and they were formidable opponents to anyone who challenged them. Yet they were also traders, and the Comanche trading network extended from the Spanish settlements in New Mexico to the French traders on the Mississippi River. This was the world that existed in Colorado for centuries before Europeans arrived. It wasn't an empty wilderness, but a landscape inhabited by diverse peoples, each with their own cultures, languages, and ways of understanding and relating to their environment. These weren't static, unchanging societies, frozen in some timeless past. They were dynamic, adapting, trading with each other, sometimes fighting, forming alliances, creating and maintaining complex social and spiritual traditions. And then from the south came rumors, and then reality of newcomers, people who looked different, spoke languages no one had heard before, and brought with them strange animals, goods never seen before, and diseases that would prove catastrophic. These cities didn't exist, at least not in the form the Spanish imagined. The stories had been based on garbled accounts of Pueblo villages, which, with their multi-story buildings and use of stone, were indeed impressive, but certainly not made of gold. Coronado's expedition traveled through what is now New Mexico and onto the Great Plains, possibly reaching as far as Kansas. Whether any members of his expedition actually entered what is now Colorado remains uncertain, but they certainly came close, and they encountered peoples who lived in and traveled through the region. The Spanish, having conquered the great empires of Mexico and South America, were expanding northward, driven by the twin motives of finding wealth and spreading Christianity. In 1540, just 48 years after Columbus's first voyage, a Spanish expedition, led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, set out from Mexico City, heading north in search of the fabled 7 cities of gold. Cities that, according to stories the Spanish had heard, were fabulously wealthy, with buildings decorated with precious stones and streets paved with gold. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, were catastrophic for Native American populations, which had no immunity to these pathogens. Estimates vary, but many scholars believe that as much as 90% of Native American populations died from disease in the centuries. Following European contact, entire communities were wiped out, social structures collapsed. Knowledge holders, elders who maintained oral traditions and specialized knowledge, died before they could pass on what they knew to the next generation. The scale of this catastrophe is almost impossible to comprehend, and it fundamentally reshaped the human geography of the Americas. The expedition was by Spanish standards a failure. They found no gold, no wealthy cities to plunder, but they did open the door to future Spanish expansion. In the following decades, more expeditions ventured north, mapping the region, establishing relationships, sometimes friendly, but often hostile, with native peoples. Spanish missionaries began establishing missions in New Mexico, seeking to convert the Pueblo peoples to Christianity. The Spanish colonial presence in New Mexico, established firmly by 1600, had profound effects on the native peoples of the region, including those in Colorado. The Spanish brought horses, which, as we've discussed, transformed plains cultures. They also brought metal tools, new crops, and new technologies. But they also brought violence, forced labor, attempts to suppress native religions and lifeways, and most devastating of all, diseases. Throughout the 1700s, Spanish expeditions occasionally ventured into Colorado from their New Mexico base. They were exploring, trading, seeking new routes, and trying to assert Spanish claims to the region. In 1776, the same year that American colonists on the distant Atlantic coast were declaring independence from Britain, two Franciscan friars, Silvestre Valdez de Escalante and Francisco Atanasio Dominguez, set out on an ambitious journey. They hoped to find a route from Santa Fe, New Mexico, to the Spanish missions in California. They traveled north through Colorado, becoming the first Europeans to document much of the region, keeping careful journals that describe the landscape, the native peoples they encountered, and the challenges of the journey. The Spanish returned in 1692, reconquering New Mexico, though the terms of Spanish rule were somewhat less harsh than they had been before the revolt. The Pueblo peoples had demonstrated they could not be taken for granted, and the Spanish, having learned a painful lesson, approached the Pueblo more cautiously, allowing them greater autonomy in internal affairs and showing somewhat more tolerance for native religious practices, at least when they didn't directly challenge Spanish authority. In 1680, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, having endured decades of Spanish oppression, rose in coordinated revolt. In what is known as the Pueblo Revolt, they drove the Spanish out of New Mexico, killing hundreds of colonists and missionaries and forcing the remainder to flee south to El Paso. For the next 12 years, the Pueblo were independent, though the various Pueblo communities didn't always cooperate with each other. Old rivalries and differences resurfacing once the common enemy was gone. The expedition didn't reach California. Harsh weather and difficult terrain forced them to turn back, but their journey added significantly to Spanish knowledge of the region. Their journals described meetings with Ute bands, trading with them, and trying to encourage them to settle in missions, efforts that were largely unsuccessful. The Utes saw little advantage in abandoning their mobile lifestyle and traditional ways to live under Spanish authority. But Spanish presence in Colorado itself remained minimal. There were no Spanish settlements, no missions, no permanent presence north of New Mexico. Colorado was the far northern frontier of New Spain, a region marked on maps as Spanish territory, but not actually controlled by Spain in any meaningful way. The native peoples of Colorado continued to live much as they always had, increasingly aware of the Spanish presence to the south, but not directly governed by it. Spanish names were given to many Colorado features during these early expeditions. The Colorado River, the mountains, various peaks and valleys, all received Spanish names, some of which survive today, others long since replaced by English names given by later American explorers and settlers. Then, at the beginning of the 1800s, the geopolitical situation in North America changed dramatically. In 1800, Spain transferred the vast Louisiana territory to France. In 1803, France, needing money to fund its wars in Europe, sold Louisiana to the United States. With the stroke of a pen, the United States suddenly claimed territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, though the western boundary of Louisiana was vague and disputed. Pike's orders were to explore the Arkansas and Red Rivers, to make contact with native peoples, and to gather information about this largely unknown region. In July 1806, Pike and his small party of about 24 men set out from Louis, heading west across the plains. It was an ambitious undertaking, perhaps overly so. Pike was young, just 27 years old, and while he was energetic and brave, he was perhaps not the most experienced wilderness explorer. The United States, now a significant presence on the North American continent, was eager to explore its new territory. President Thomas Jefferson commissioned the famous Lewis and Clark expedition, which traveled up the Missouri River, crossed the Rockies, and reached the Pacific Ocean. But Jefferson also commissioned other less famous expeditions to explore different parts of Louisiana. One of these was led by a young Army lieutenant named Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Pike's expedition continued west into the mountains, where they struggled through one of the coldest winters on record. At one point, they built a small stockade on the Conejos River, probably in present-day southern Colorado, though Pike thought he was on the Red River in Louisiana territory. He wasn't. He was actually in Spanish territory, and Spanish authorities, who had been alerted to the presence of an American military expedition in their territory, sent troops to investigate. The party traveled west across Kansas and into Colorado, following the Arkansas River. In November, from somewhere on the plains of eastern Colorado, Pike spotted a distant mountain peak rising above the horizon. He called it Grand Peak, and he was struck by its magnificence. This peak, which would later be named Pike's Peak in his honor, despite his failure to climb it, became one of the most famous mountains in Colorado. Pike decided to try to reach the summit. He and several companions set out from their camp, woefully unprepared for winter mountaineering. They were inadequately clothed, had insufficient food, and frankly had no real idea how far away the mountain was or how difficult the climb would be. After struggling through deep snow in bitter cold, they gave up, nowhere near the summit. Pike wrote in his journal that he doubted the peak could ever be climbed by any human. This would prove amusingly wrong. 14 years later, members of Major Stephen Long's expedition would reach the summit. And today, a paved highway runs to the top, with a visitor center and gift shop at the summit. Spanish soldiers found Pike's party and politely but firmly arrested them. Pike was taken south into Mexico, questioned, and his papers were confiscated. The Spanish suspected, probably correctly, that Pike's expedition was part of an American effort to gather intelligence about Spanish territories, perhaps in preparation for future American expansion. After several months, Pike and his men were released and escorted back to Louisiana. A somewhat humiliating end to the expedition. Despite, or perhaps because of, these mishaps, Pike's expedition made him famous when he returned to the United States and published an account of his travels. His description of the Great Plains as a desert unsuitable for American settlement would influence thinking about the region for decades. Though he was wrong about this, as later events would prove. His reports about the wealth of furs available in the Rockies and about the Spanish territories in the Southwest were read with great interest. Americans were learning about the West, and some were beginning to see opportunities there. The fur trade, which had been active in the northern Rockies for years, began to expand into Colorado in the early 1800s. The incentive was simple. Beaver pelts were extremely valuable in European and American markets, where they were turned into felt for hats. A fashionable gentleman's beaver hat could cost a substantial sum, and the insatiable demand for these hats drove trappers into the remotest wilderness areas in search of beaver. The rendezvous system was developed in the 1820s as an efficient way to supply trappers and collect their furs. Instead of trappers having to travel all the way back to St. Louis or other cities to sell their pelts and buy supplies, traders would bring goods west to a predetermined location. There, for several weeks each summer, trappers, traders, and native peoples would gather in a massive temporary fair. A wild celebration where furs changed hands, supplies were purchased at inflated prices, and months of isolation were forgotten in drinking, gambling, storytelling, contests of skill, and general revelry. These mountain men, as they came to be called, were a unique breed. They were tough, self-reliant, skilled in wilderness survival, and willing to endure incredible hardships for the chance of profit. They lived among native peoples, often marrying native women, learning native languages, and adopting many native customs, while maintaining their own cultural identity as Americans or Europeans. They were intermediaries between two worlds, fluent in both, but fully belonging to neither. The mountain men's year followed a predictable pattern. Spring and fall were trapping seasons, when beaver pelts were at their prime, thick and luxurious. Trappers would work the cold streams and rivers, setting their traps in the icy water, checking them daily, a dangerous and exhausting routine. Winter was a time to hole up, to wait out the worst weather in a sheltered camp or at a trading post. And summer brought the great gathering, the rendezvous. The trappers who worked the Colorado mountains were characters of legendary proportions. Men like Jim Bridger, who would go on to discover important routes through the Rockies and become a famous guide. Kit Carson, who trapped in Colorado before achieving fame as a scout and guide. The Bent brothers, who established trading posts and married into Cheyenne families, becoming important intermediaries between native peoples and Americans. These men lived lives of extraordinary adventure and hardship, and while later writers would romanticize their exploits, the reality was often brutal. Many mountain men died young, killed by accidents, disease, harsh weather, or violence. Trading posts began appearing in Colorado in the 1830s, permanent or semi-permanent establishments where trappers could trade and resupply. The most famous was Bent's Fort. built in 1833 on the Arkansas River in southeastern Colorado. This massive adobe structure was built in the style of a Spanish fort, with high walls surrounding a central courtyard. It served as a major trading center, a place where mountain men, Plains, Indians, and American and Mexican traders all came to do business. These rendezvous were held at various locations in the Rockies and surrounding regions, and several took place in what is now Colorado. Brown's Hole, a remote valley where Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah meet, was a favorite gathering spot. The valley offered good grass for horses, plentiful game, and shelter from weather. It was neutral ground where even rival groups could meet in relative peace. Bent's Fort was remarkably sophisticated for a wilderness outpost. It had a blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, storage rooms, living quarters, and even a billiard room. The Bent brothers, Charles and William, treated their native trading partners with respect, learning their languages, participating in their ceremonies, and marrying Cheyenne women. This helped them maintain good relationships with the powerful Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, relationships that were crucial to the fort's success and safety. But the fur trade's glory days were limited. By the late 1830s, beaver populations had been drastically reduced by overhunting. More importantly, fashion changed. Silk hats began replacing beaver felt as the preferred style among gentlemen, and the bottom fell out of the beaver market. The last great rendezvous was held in 1840. Many mountain men found themselves obsolete, their skills and knowledge still valuable, but their profession gone. Some adapted, becoming scouts and guides for military expeditions and immigrant trains. Others settled down, establishing ranches or farms. A few, like Kit Carson, became famous in other capacities. The era of the mountain man was ending, but their knowledge of the West would prove invaluable in the coming decades as American expansion accelerated. The American government, meanwhile, was increasingly interested in the West. In the 1840s, several scientific and military expeditions were sent to map the region and assess its resources and potential. John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, led multiple expeditions through Colorado and the broader West, producing detailed maps and reports that would guide later immigrants. His expeditions were often guided by mountain men like Kit Carson, whose expertise was essential to their success. These expeditions weren't purely scientific. They were also about asserting American presence and claims. The United States had expanded to the Pacific, with the acquisition of Oregon and the conquest of California and the Southwest during the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended that war, transferred vast territories from Mexico to the United States, including parts of what would become Colorado. The region was now firmly part of the United States, at least on paper. But what did this mean for the native peoples who had lived in Colorado for millennia? To them, these treaties between distant governments meant little. The land was theirs by use, by tradition, by the graves of their ancestors. The idea that European powers could claim territory simply by drawing lines on maps and signing documents was foreign to their understanding of land ownership and use rights. As American immigrants began crossing the plains in increasing numbers during the 1840s, heading to Oregon and California, tensions began to rise. The immigrants' wagon trains disrupted buffalo migrations, depleted grass that native peoples needed for their horses, brought diseases, and sometimes led to violent confrontations. The U.S. government attempted to manage these tensions through treaties, agreements that would define boundaries, establish peace, and compensate native peoples for the use of their lands by the wagon trains. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was one such attempt. Representatives of various Plains tribes, including the Cheyenne and Arapaho, who claimed much of Colorado, met with U.S. officials at Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. The treaty attempted to define the territories of different tribes, establish peace between them and the United States, and allow safe passage for immigrants crossing the plains. In exchange, the tribes would receive annual payments of goods and money. The treaty looked good on paper, but it had fundamental problems. The U.S. negotiators didn't fully understand Plains' political structures. The chiefs who signed the treaty didn't necessarily have authority over all members of their tribes, and many people were never consulted or didn't feel bound by agreements they hadn't made. The boundaries defined in the treaty didn't always match traditional ranges and often conflicted with patterns of movement that had existed for generations. And most fundamentally, many native peoples didn't understand that the Americans saw these treaties as permanent land cessions rather than temporary agreements about shared use. Through the 1850s, Colorado remained a thinly populated frontier, at least by American standards. There were a few trading posts, a handful of scattered ranches and small settlements, some military posts. The vast majority of Colorado was still native territory in practice, whatever the maps in Washington might show. But that was about to change dramatically, and suddenly, with a discovery that would transform Colorado forever. In 1858, a small party of prospectors led by William Greene Russell, who had previously prospected in Georgia, made their way to the confluence of the South Platte River and Cherry Creek in what is now downtown Denver. They were looking for gold, and in July of that year they found it. The amounts were small, just traces in the creek beds, but it was real gold, and word spread quickly. By the next year, 1859, gold fever had struck. Pikes Peak or bust became the rallying cry, even though the gold wasn't actually near Pikes Peak. Tens of thousands of people, perhaps as many as 100,000, set out across the plains, heading for the Colorado goldfields. They came in wagons, on horseback, even pulling hand. Many woefully unprepared for the journey, or for the realities of prospecting. The newspapers back east printed wild exaggerations about the amount of gold waiting to be found, and many people believed they would simply arrive and pick up gold from the ground. The reality was far different. Many of the early arrivals found little or no gold and turned back in disgust, spreading the word that the whole thing was a hoax. Pikes Peak or bust was scrawled on the sides of wagons heading back east. But some persisted, and in May 1859, a prospector named John Gregory found a rich vein of gold in a gulch in the mountains west of Denver. The Gregory lode, as it became known, was the real thing, a genuinely rich deposit. Other strikes followed at Central City, Black Hawk, and other locations in the mountains. A gold rush was truly on. Unlike the early surface placer mining, which involved panning for gold in streams, this was hard rock mining, requiring excavation, tunneling, and processing ore. It required capital, equipment, and organization. Individual prospectors gave way to mining companies. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Rough collections of tents and hastily built wooden structures that housed thousands of miners, merchants, gamblers, and all the others who followed the strikes. These early mining camps were chaotic, often lawless places. There was no formal government, no police force, no established legal system. Miners created their own rough justice, forming mining districts that established rules about claims and settling disputes. Sometimes, these systems worked reasonably well, based on democratic principles and relatively fair enforcement. Other times, justice was swift and brutal, with lynch mobs dealing out punishment to those accused of theft or murder. The communities that formed during the gold rush were remarkably diverse. There were Americans from every state, immigrants from Europe, particularly from Germany, Ireland, and Cornwall, the latter bringing valuable hard rock mining expertise. There were also Chinese immigrants who often worked abandoned claims or provided services like laundry and restaurants. African Americans, both free people and former slaves seeking opportunity in the West, were also part of the rush. Mexican miners brought techniques learned in the mines of Mexico and South America. Women were a minority in these early mining camps, but they were present and often found opportunities that wouldn't have been available to them in more established communities. Some women ran boarding houses, restaurants, or stores, businesses that catered to the overwhelmingly male population. A few women even staked their own mining claims and worked them successfully. In a frontier society that was being created from scratch, traditional social restrictions were sometimes relaxed, though prejudices and discrimination certainly still existed. Denver, named after James Denver, the governor of Kansas Territory, quickly emerged as the supply center for the mining regions. It wasn't in the mountains where the gold was, but at the edge of the plains where the roads from the east arrived. Merchants in Denver outfitted miners heading to the gold fields and bought gold from those returning. The city grew rapidly, and competition with other early towns like Auraria and Golden was fierce. Each wanted to become the dominant settlement in the region. The presence of thousands of American settlers changed everything for native peoples. The area that had been their territory was suddenly filled with foreigners who showed little respect for native land rights or presence. Miners and settlers saw the land as empty and available, ignoring the fact that native peoples were still using it for hunting and gathering. The buffalo herds, already under pressure, faced new threats as miners and settlers hunted them for food and sport, often wastefully taking only the choicest parts and leaving the rest to rot. The U.S. government, responding to pressure from settlers and from mining interests who wanted secure access to the gold fields, negotiated new treaties with the Cheyenne and Arapaho in 1861. The Treaty of Fort Wise drastically reduced the territory that had been assigned to these tribes in the Fort Laramie Treaty just 10 years earlier. Instead of a vast territory covering much of Colorado and parts of neighboring states, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were now assigned to a small reservation in southeastern Colorado between the Arkansas River and Sand Creek. Many Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders refused to sign this treaty, arguing that it gave away their homeland for inadequate compensation. But some chiefs, perhaps believing they had no choice, perhaps misunderstanding what they were signing, did agree. The result was division within the tribes, with some bands accepting the treaty and others rejecting it and continuing to live and hunt in their traditional territories. In 1861, Colorado Territory was officially organized. The region was separated from Kansas Territory and given its own territorial government. William Gilpin was appointed as the first territorial governor. Colorado was on its way to becoming a state, though that wouldn't happen for another 15 years. The territorial government faced enormous challenges, trying to establish order, create functioning institutions, and deal with the increasingly tense situation with native peoples. The early 1860s were years of mounting tension and conflict. Some Cheyenne and Arapaho bands raided isolated ranches and wagon trains, taking horses and goods, sometimes killing settlers. Some of these raids were acts of resistance against the encroachment on their lands. Others were traditional raids that had been part of Plains culture for generations. From the settlers' perspective, these were unprovoked attacks by savages. From the native perspective, they were defending their homeland against invaders. The U.S. Army established forts in Colorado to protect settlers and to try to control native movements. But the Civil War, which began in 1861, meant that experienced troops were needed back east. And Colorado's military posts were often manned by poorly trained volunteer units. These volunteers, many of them recent immigrants with no understanding of native cultures and often harboring racist views, were ill-suited to the complex task of managing relations with native peoples. In 1864, tensions exploded into violence in one of the most tragic events in Colorado history, the Sand Creek Massacre. In November of that year, a band of Cheyenne and Arapaho, led by Chiefs Black Kettle and White Antelope, were camped along Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. They believed they were under the protection of the U.S. Army, having been told to camp there by authorities at Fort Lyon. Black Kettle, who had always sought peace with the Americans, flew both an American flag and a white flag over his lodge to demonstrate his peaceful intentions. Colonel John Chivington, a former Methodist minister who commanded Colorado's volunteer cavalry, decided to attack the camp. Chivington was ambitious, possibly with political aspirations, and he saw an attack on native peoples as a way to build his reputation. He also harbored virulent anti-Indian views, reportedly saying that native people should be killed and scalped, even infants, declaring that nits make lice. On the morning of November 29, 1864, Chivington's force of around 700 men attacked the sleeping village. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The soldiers killed indiscriminately, murdering men, women, and children. Estimates of the dead range from around 150 to 200 people, the majority of them women, children, and elderly. The soldiers mutilated the bodies in horrific ways, taking scalps and other body parts as trophies. Some of these gruesome trophies were later displayed in Denver, where they were cheered by some of the population. Black Kettle survived the massacre, though his wife was badly wounded. He continued to seek peace even after this betrayal. White Antelope did not survive, dying in the attack after singing his death song. The Sand Creek Massacre shocked many Americans when the truth about what had happened became known. Congressional investigations condemned Chivington's actions, though he was never punished, having already resigned from the military. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Sand Creek was a devastating blow and a betrayal that would not be forgotten. Many who had sought accommodation with the Americans now turned to armed resistance. Raids intensified across the plains in 1865 and 1866, as warriors sought revenge and fought to defend their remaining territory. The conflict spread, affecting not just Colorado, but much of the Central Plains. The U.S. government's response was more treaties and more military force. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 relocated most Cheyenne and Arapaho to reservations in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. Some bands refused to go, continuing to fight for their homeland. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, sustained military campaigns gradually forced most of the remaining free bands onto reservations. The era of Cheyenne and Arapaho dominance on the Colorado Plains was ending. The Utes, whose territory was primarily in the mountains of western Colorado, faced a different but equally destructive trajectory. As American settlement expanded and mining moved into mountain areas, pressure mounted to remove the Utes from Colorado entirely. Various treaties in the 1860s and 1870s progressively reduced Ute territory. The discovery of valuable minerals in the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado led to demands that the Utes cede even more land. In 1879, tensions on the White River Ute Reservation in northwestern Colorado boiled over. Nathan Meeker, the Indian agent at the reservation, was a rigid idealist who was determined to transform the Utes into farmers regardless of their wishes or the suitability of their land for agriculture. He plowed up their horse racing track, a deeply insulting act in a culture that valued horses highly. He made other demands that the Utes found unreasonable and offensive. In September 1879, violence erupted. Meeker and several other agency employees were killed, and Meeker's wife and daughter were taken captive. The U.S. Army was called in, and a relief column was attacked by Ute warriors at Milk Creek. Several soldiers were killed before reinforcements arrived. The incident gave those who wanted the Utes removed from Colorado the excuse they needed. "The Utes must go" became a popular slogan. Despite the fact that most youth bands had not been involved in the violence, and despite the provocations that had led to it, the government decided to remove the Utes from Colorado. The White River Utes were forced to move to a reservation in Utah. The Uncompahgre Utes were relocated to a reservation in Utah as well. Only the Southern Utes in the far southwestern corner of Colorado were allowed to remain on a much reduced reservation. By the early 1880s, the native peoples who had lived in Colorado for thousands of years had been largely removed from their homeland, confined to small reservations, or forced to move to other states entirely. This dispossession was tragic and unjust, driven by greed for land and resources, by racism, and by a fundamental refusal to respect native peoples' rights and humanity. The treaties were repeatedly broken or rewritten when they inconvenienced American expansion. Promises made were promises broken. The story of native peoples in Colorado during the 19th century is one of resistance, resilience, survival in the face of overwhelming odds, but also of tremendous loss. While these conflicts were playing out, Colorado was experiencing explosive growth and transformation driven by mining. The initial gold rush of 1859 had focused on placer mining and relatively easily accessible surface deposits. But by the mid-1860s, the easy gold was mostly gone, and mining was becoming an industrial enterprise. This required capital, machinery, and technical expertise that individual prospectors didn't have. Mining companies began to dominate, raising money from investors back east or in Europe to finance expensive operations. They built stamp mills to crush ore, smelters to extract metals from, and extensive tunnel systems to reach ore bodies deep underground. Towns like Central City, Black Hawk, Georgetown, and Leadville grew into substantial communities with brick buildings, hotels, theaters, newspapers, schools, and all the amenities of civilization. Albeit, civilization perched on the sides of mountains, at elevations that made simply breathing a challenge for newcomers. The social world of these mining towns was complex. At the top were the mine owners and investors, men who often became fabulously wealthy. Below them were the managers, engineers, and skilled workers who ran the operations. At the bottom were the ordinary miners, men who worked underground in dangerous conditions for modest wages. Accidents were common. Caverns, gas explosions, falls, and the slow death of lung diseases caused by breathing rock dust and toxic fumes. Mining was brutal, dangerous work, and miners developed a strong sense of solidarity and common identity. Labor organizing began early in Colorado's mining districts. Miners formed unions to demand better pay, safer conditions, and an 8-hour workday, a radical idea at the time when 10 or 12-hour shifts were common. These early labor efforts sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed, and often led to conflicts between workers and mine owners that would shape Colorado's history for decades. But gold wasn't the only valuable mineral in Colorado's mountains. In 1878, two prospectors, Alvinus Wood and William Stevens, discovered massive silver deposits near what would become Leadville. The silver boom that followed dwarfed even the gold rush. Leadville, at an elevation of over 10,000 feet, became one of the largest cities in Colorado almost overnight. With a population that may have reached 30,000 at its peak, the wealth that flowed out of Leadville's mines was staggering. The Matchless Mine, owned by Horace Tabor, produced millions of dollars in silver. Tabor became one of Colorado's wealthiest men, leaving his first wife to marry the beautiful Elizabeth Baby Doe McCourt, a scandal that fascinated Colorado society. Other mines had similarly evocative names that hinted at their miners' dreams and humor: the Little Pittsburgh, the Morning Star, the Chrysolite. Silver mining made fortunes for some, but it also created a more stratified society. The capital requirements for silver mining were even higher than for gold, meaning that ownership was concentrated in fewer hands. The mining companies were often backed by Eastern or European investors who cared little for the welfare of the miners or the communities, focused solely on maximizing profits. The silver boom brought railroads to Colorado's mountains. Building rail lines through the Rockies was an extraordinary engineering achievement, requiring tunnels through solid rock, bridges spanning deep gorges, tracks that switch-backed up steep mountainsides. But railroads were essential. They made it economically feasible to ship ore out and bring in supplies, equipment, and people. The arrival of a railroad could make or break a mining town. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, founded by William Jackson Palmer in 1870, became the most extensive narrow-gauge railroad network in North America, reaching into remote mining districts throughout Colorado. Narrow-gauge lines, with tracks spaced just 3 feet apart instead of the standard 4 feet 8.5 inches, could navigate tighter curves and steeper grades, making them ideal for mountain terrain. Though they couldn't interconnect with standard gauge lines without transferring cargo, these railroads opened Colorado in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. Previously, freight had to be hauled by wagon over rough mountain roads, a slow and expensive process. With railroads, the journey time from Denver to mountain towns shrank from days to hours, and the cost of shipping ore and goods dropped dramatically. Towns connected to the railroad thrived, while those bypassed often withered and died. The railroads also brought tourists. By the 1870s and 1880s, Colorado was being discovered by people seeking more than wealth. The mountains, the scenery, the supposedly healthful climate, all attracted visitors. Colorado Springs, founded by General Palmer in 1871, was designed from the start as a resort town, a place where genteel Easterners could enjoy mountain scenery and comfort. The town was carefully planned with wide streets, parks, and strict rules against saloons and vice, distinguishing it from the rougher mining camps. Manitou Springs, just west of Colorado Springs, became famous for its mineral springs, which were believed to have healing properties. Hotels and bathhouses catered to health seekers, people suffering from tuberculosis, asthma, and other ailments who believed that Colorado's dry air and mineral waters would cure them. Some did find relief, others didn't. But the health tourism industry became an important part of Colorado's economy. The natural wonders of Colorado were also attracting attention. In 1873, members of the Hayden Survey, a government-sponsored scientific expedition, explored the mountain that would be named after their leader, Ferdinand Hayden. Their reports and photographs helped inspire the creation of the Colorado Mountain Club and later conservation efforts. Artists like Albert Bierstadt painted dramatic scenes of Colorado's mountains, introducing Eastern audiences to the grandeur of the West. By 1876, Colorado's population had grown substantially, reaching the 125,000 residents required for statehood. On August 1, 1876, Colorado became the 38th state, entering the Union exactly 100 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, earning it the nickname the Centennial State. The state's first governor was John Root, and the capital was established at Denver, which had emerged victorious in its competition with Golden and other cities to become the state's economic and political center. Statehood brought pride and a sense of permanence. But Colorado faced significant challenges. The economy was heavily dependent on mining, which was unpredictable and boom-bust in nature. When metal prices were high, prosperity reigned. When they fell, unemployment and hardship followed. The state's population was concentrated in a few areas, with vast stretches of territory empty or nearly so. And the question of water, how to use this precious resource in an arid region, was already becoming contentious. Agriculture was expanding on the plains, with homesteaders claiming land under the Homestead Act and various other land distribution programs. These farmers faced enormous challenges. The climate was much drier than what most had known back east. Rainfall was unpredictable, droughts were common, and early attempts at farming often failed. The government had promoted the idea that rain follows the plow, a theory that cultivation would somehow increase rainfall. But this was nonsense, wishful thinking that had no basis in reality. Some farmers succeeded by adapting their techniques, dry land farming methods that conserved moisture, crops like wheat and corn that could handle drier conditions, and increasingly, irrigation, where rivers and streams flowed, farmers dug ditches and canals to bring water to their fields. Water rights became a complex legal issue, and Colorado developed the doctrine of prior appropriation. The principle that whoever first put water to beneficial use had the right to continue using that water. A first-in-time, first-in-right system that was very different from Eastern water law. Ranching also became important in eastern Colorado and in the mountain valleys. Cattle drives from Texas would end in Colorado, where cattle could be fattened on good grass before being shipped by rail to eastern markets. Some ranchers established large operations, controlling vast expanses of rangeland, often using both owned and public land. Cowboys, those iconic figures of the American West, were working men who lived hard lives, enduring extreme weather, dangerous work, and modest pay. The romantic image of the cowboy was largely a later invention, but the reality was that these men were essential to the cattle industry that became a cornerstone of Colorado's economy. The 1880s saw continued growth and prosperity in Colorado, driven by silver mining and by the expansion of agriculture and ranching. But the silver boom, spectacular as it was, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Silver's value was tied to government policy, specifically to the question of whether silver would be used to back U.S. currency alongside gold. In 1873, Congress had passed the Coinage Act, which effectively ended the free coinage of silver, meaning the government would no longer buy unlimited quantities of silver to mint into coins. Silver mining interests called this the crime of 73, and they lobbied vigorously to restore silver's monetary role. They had some success. The Blandallison Act of 1878 and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 required the government to purchase significant amounts of silver, supporting the price and making silver mining profitable. But in 1893, during a severe economic depression, Congress repealed the Sherman Act, and the federal government stopped buying silver. The price of silver collapsed, falling from over $1 an ounce to around 60 cents almost overnight. For Colorado's silver mining industry, this was catastrophic. Mines closed, smelters shut down, workers were laid off by the thousands. Towns that had boomed now went bust. Leadville, Aspen, and other silver centers faced economic devastation. The collapse was swift and brutal. Horace Tabor, who had been one of Colorado's wealthiest men, lost everything. He died impoverished in 1899, working as a postmaster in Denver, a job friends had secured for him out of pity. His wife, Baby Doe, clung to the worthless, matchless mine for decades, living in a cabin at the mine site, still believing it would someday be valuable again. She died there in 1935, frozen to death in the harsh mountain winter. A tragic end to a legendary Colorado story. The silver crash forced Colorado to diversify its economy. Some mining towns never recovered, becoming ghost towns, their buildings abandoned to the elements, slowly collapsing and returning to the earth. Others adapted, finding new industries, or in some cases like Aspen, eventually reinventing themselves as tourist destinations. But that transformation would take decades. Gold mining, less affected by the silver crash, since gold's price was more stable, continued and even expanded. The Cripple Creek Gold District on the southwestern slope of Pikes Peak was discovered in 1891 and became one of the world's great gold mining camps. Cripple Creek gold was different from earlier strikes. It was found in hard volcanic rock rather than in placer deposits or veins, and extracting it required different techniques. But the deposits were rich, and Cripple Creek attracted tens of thousands of people and produced hundreds of millions of dollars in gold over the following decades. Cripple Creek also became a battleground in labor struggles that would define Colorado's early 20th century. Mining was dangerous work, and miners in Cripple Creek and elsewhere organized to demand better conditions. The Western Federation of Miners, a radical labor union, became powerful in Colorado's mining districts. In 1894, miners in Cripple Creek struck, demanding an 8-hour workday after a tense standoff that nearly erupted into violence. The miners won a significant victory for organized labor, but the mine owners didn't accept defeat gracefully. In subsequent years, conflicts between labor and capital became increasingly bitter and violent. The Colorado labor wars of the early 1900s saw armed confrontations, bombings, and state militia called in to break strikes. The most infamous event was the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, though this occurred in a coal mining district in southern Colorado rather than in the hard rock mining regions. Coal mining had become increasingly important to Colorado's economy, providing fuel for homes, businesses, and the railroads. The coal mines, located in places like Trinidad, Walsenburg, and the canyons north of Denver, employed thousands of workers, many of them recent immigrants from southern and eastern Europe. Working conditions in the coal mines were abysmal. The mines were dangerous, wages were low. Workers lived in company towns where they had to buy from company stores at inflated prices. And the mine owners exercised almost total control over every aspect of workers' lives. In September 1913, coal miners across southern Colorado went on strike, demanding better pay, safer conditions, recognition of their union, and an end to exploitative company town practices. The mine operators, principally the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, controlled by the Rockefeller family, refused to negotiate. The striking miners were evicted from company housing and set up tent colonies to shelter their families. The largest of these was at Ludlow. The strike dragged on through the winter with tensions mounting. The state government, responding to pressure from mine owners, called in the National Guard, ostensibly to keep peace, but in practice, often supporting the companies. On April 20, 1914, Guardsmen attacked the Ludlow tent colony. Exactly what started the violence remains disputed, but gunfire erupted, and the soldiers set fire to the tents. In the chaos, people died, including 2 women and 11 children who suffocated in a pit beneath a burning tent where they had taken shelter. The Ludlow massacre shocked the nation. It exposed the brutal realities of industrial labor conditions and sparked investigations and reforms. John D. Rockefeller Jr., facing intense criticism, eventually implemented some workplace improvements and established company unions, though these fell far short of genuine worker representation. The massacre became a rallying cry for the labor movement nationwide, a symbol of workers' struggles against corporate power. These labor struggles revealed deep fault lines in Colorado society. The state had developed rapidly, but wealth was concentrated in relatively few hands, while many working people faced harsh conditions and limited opportunities. The Progressive Era, that period of reform in the early 20th century, brought some changes. Regulations on working conditions, child labor laws, political reforms like the initiative and referendum. Colorado women gained the right to vote in 1893, one of the first states to grant women's suffrage. 27 years before the 19th Amendment extended that right nationally. But progress was uneven and contested. Mining remained dangerous. Agriculture faced challenges from drought and market fluctuations. And the state's economy continued to be vulnerable to boom and bust cycles. World War I brought temporary prosperity. Demand for Colorado's metals and agricultural products boosted the economy. But the 1920s saw agriculture, especially, suffering as prices collapsed after wartime inflation. The 1920s also saw the Ku Klux Klan gain disturbing power in Colorado. The Klan, which had been revived nationally in 1915, found fertile ground in Colorado, playing on nativist sentiments, anti-Catholic prejudice, and fears about immigration and social change. At its peak in the mid-1920s, the Klan may have had as many as 50,000 members in Colorado, and it wielded significant political influence, helping to elect governors, senators, and other officials. The Colorado Klan was somewhat different from its southern counterpart. While racism was certainly part of its ideology, the Colorado Klan focused particularly on anti-Catholicism and opposition to immigrants, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe. Klan members paraded openly through Denver streets, held rallies, and intimidated those they considered undesirable. But the Klan's power was relatively short-lived. Scandals involving Klan leaders discredited the organization, and by the late 1920s, its influence had collapsed. The Great Depression hit Colorado hard, as it did the entire nation. Mines closed as demand for metals plummeted. Agriculture, already struggling, faced near collapse as prices fell to unsustainable levels. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, caused by a combination of severe drought and poor farming practices, devastated parts of eastern Colorado. Massive dust storms darkened the skies, buried fences and equipment, and made farming impossible in some areas. Many families abandoned their farms, joining the desperate migration westward. Immortalized in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, the federal government's New Deal programs brought some relief to Colorado. Public works projects employed thousands, building roads, bridges, parks, and public buildings, many of which are still in use today. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work on conservation projects, planting trees, building trails, and improving forest lands. These programs didn't end the Depression, but they provided crucial support to disparate communities and families. One interesting development during the 1930s was the growth of tourism, as people sought inexpensive recreation. Colorado's natural beauty was increasingly seen as an asset, something that could be developed economically without depending on mining or agriculture. ski resorts began to develop, initially quite modest operations, but hinting at what would become a major industry. Skiing had been practiced in Colorado since the 19th century, mostly as transportation by miners who needed to get around during winter, but recreational skiing was beginning to catch on. The first ski areas were simple, a rope tow and a warming hut. Nothing like the elaborate resorts we know today, but they represented the beginning of an industry that would transform Colorado's economy and identity. World War II brought dramatic changes to Colorado. Military bases were established across the state. Camp Carson near Colorado Springs, Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and others. These bases brought thousands of service members to Colorado, many of whom would return after the war to make the state their home. The military presence also brought federal money and infrastructure development that would benefit Colorado for decades. One lesser-known aspect of Colorado's World War II history was the internment of Japanese Americans. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government forcibly relocated people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, imprisoning them in internment camps. One of these camps, Amachi, was located in southeastern Colorado, near the town of Granada. Over 7,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were held there under harsh conditions, living in crowded barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, their only crime being their ancestry. This remains a shameful chapter in American history, a reminder that fear and prejudice can lead even democratic societies to commit grave injustices. After the war ended, Colorado entered a period of remarkable growth and transformation. Returning veterans took advantage of the GI Bill to buy homes and attend college. The economy diversified, becoming less dependent on mining and more balanced between industry, agriculture, services, and tourism. Denver grew rapidly, spreading outward across the plains, transforming from a regional center into a major metropolitan area. The ski industry expanded dramatically in the post-war years. Aspen, which had nearly died after the silver crash, reinvented itself as a ski resort and cultural center. In 1947, the town hosted its first major ski competition, and in 1950, Aspen became the site of the Aspen Music Festival, which attracted world-class musicians and helped establish the town as a cultural destination as well as a ski resort. Other ski areas developed as well. Vail opened in 1962, quickly becoming one of the world's premier ski destinations, and numerous other resorts followed. Skiing transformed mountain towns and created a new vision of Colorado. The state became associated with outdoor recreation, healthy living, natural beauty, an image far different from the mining and cattle ranching that had defined it in the 19th century. This transformation wasn't without costs. Small mountain communities sometimes struggled with rapid growth, rising property values that priced out longtime residents, environmental impacts from development, and the challenges of balancing growth with preservation. The post-war period also saw the development of Colorado's defense and aerospace industries. Companies like Martin Marietta, later Lockheed Martin, established major facilities in the Denver area. The National Center for Atmospheric Research was built in Boulder, designed by the famous architect I.M. Pei. The U.S. Air Force Academy opened near Colorado Springs in 1958. Its striking modernist chapel becoming one of Colorado's most recognizable buildings. These institutions brought highly educated workers, research funding, and technology industries to Colorado, helping to diversify the economy away from its extractive industries' roots. The environmental movement found strong support in Colorado. The state's magnificent landscapes inspired conservation efforts, and Coloradans increasingly saw themselves as stewards of natural resources rather than just exploiters of them. Rocky Mountain National Park, established in 1915, attracted millions of visitors. The state created its own park system, preserving important natural and historical sites. Wilderness areas were designated, protecting millions of acres of federal land from development. Yet, tensions between preservation and development remained. Proposals to build ski areas or roads in wilderness areas sparked fierce debates. Water projects, dams that would flood valleys to provide water for cities and farms, divided communities between those who saw them as necessary development and those who mourned the loss of wild rivers and canyons. The proposal to build the Two Forks Dam on the South Platte River in the 1980s became a major controversy, ultimately rejected after a long battle, a rare victory for preservationists over development interests. Water continued to be Colorado's most contentious issue. The state's rivers flow to other states. The Colorado River provides water to California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. The Arkansas River flows to Kansas, the Platte to Nebraska, Yet, Colorado's own needs for water were growing as population increased and agriculture expanded. Complex systems of reservoirs, tunnels, and canals were built to capture mountain snowmelt and transport it to the Front Range cities and to the eastern plains. The Big Thompson Project, completed in the 1950s, tunnels water from the western slope of the Rockies through the mountains to the east. An engineering marvel that also represented a fundamental reordering of natural water flows. These water projects enabled growth, but also sparked resentment. Western slope communities felt that their water was being stolen to benefit Front Range cities. Downstream states worried that Colorado was taking too much water, leaving insufficient flows for their needs. Farmers competed with cities for limited water supplies. And environmentalists worried about the impacts on rivers, wetlands, and aquatic ecosystems. These tensions continue today, becoming more acute as climate change affects snowpack and precipitation patterns. The 1960s and 1970s brought social changes to Colorado as they did to the entire nation. The state's college campuses became centers of political activism. Boulder, home to the University of Colorado, developed a reputation as a liberal countercultural community, quite different from the conservative military and ranching culture that characterized Colorado Springs and many rural areas. This political and cultural diversity has characterized Colorado ever since, making it a politically competitive state, sometimes leaning Republican, sometimes Democratic, with a libertarian streak that defies easy categorization. Denver underwent dramatic transformation in the 1970s and 1980s. The downtown, which had declined as suburban shopping centers drew business away, was revitalized with new office towers, the construction of a new convention center, and the development of the 16th Street Mall, a pedestrian-friendly street that became the heart of downtown activity. The city hosted major sporting events and attracted corporate headquarters, establishing itself as a regional hub. In 1976, Colorado made headlines by rejecting the Winter Olympics. The state had been selected to host the 1976 Winter Games, but voters, concerned about the costs and environmental impacts, voted in a referendum to refuse state funding, forcing the Olympics to be moved to Innsbruck, Austria. This decision was controversial. Supporters of the Olympics argued Colorado had missed a great opportunity, but opponents felt they had preserved the state's character and avoided unwanted growth. The decision remains unique, the only time a host has rejected the Olympics. The 1980s oil boom and bust cycle affected Colorado significantly. Rising oil prices in the late 1970s sparked an energy boom, particularly in western Colorado, where oil shale deposits promised vast reserves of petroleum. Companies invested billions in projects to extract oil from shale rock, and towns like Parachute and Rifle experienced rapid growth. But when oil prices crashed in the early 1980s, the boom turned to bust almost overnight. Projects were abandoned, workers laid off, and communities that had grown rapidly faced sudden contraction. "Please turn out the lights. The party's over," read a famous billboard capturing the bitter mood. This boom and bust pattern was nothing new for Colorado, which had experienced it repeatedly since the gold rush, but it reinforced the need for economic diversification. The state increasingly focused on attracting technology companies, service industries, tourism, and other sectors less vulnerable to commodity price swings. By the 1990s, Colorado was successfully positioning itself as a center for telecommunications, aerospace, software development, and biotechnology. The state's quality of life became a major selling point. Colorado offered outdoor recreation opportunities unmatched by most other states. Skiing in winter, hiking and mountain biking in summer, rafting, fishing, climbing, and countless other activities. The climate was sunny and relatively mild in many areas, the scenery spectacular, and the culture increasingly sophisticated with arts, music, fine dining, and other amenities. This attracted not just tourists, but also businesses and workers who could choose where to locate. Population growth accelerated, particularly along the Front Range corridor from Fort Collins through Denver and Colorado Springs to Pueblo. This region, where the mountains meet the plains, became home to most of Colorado's people, while vast areas of the eastern plains and western mountains remained sparsely populated. The growth brought prosperity, but also challenges: traffic congestion, air quality problems from auto emissions trapped against the mountains, housing shortages, and the loss of agricultural land and open space to development. Environmental issues became increasingly prominent. Denver's brown cloud, visible air pollution that often shrouded the city, became an embarrassment and a health concern, leading to stricter emissions controls. Water quality issues, particularly in mountain streams affected by acid drainage from abandoned mines, required expensive cleanup efforts. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency designated numerous Superfund sites in Colorado, locations so contaminated by mining or industrial activities that they required federal intervention to clean up. Yet, Colorado also led in environmental protection in many ways. The state pioneered renewable energy development with wind farms on the eastern plains and solar installations in sunny locations. Boulder became known for its progressive environmental policies. Colorado voters approved measures to protect open space and wildlife habitat, funding land acquisition through taxes and fees. The state's air quality improved significantly through stricter vehicle emission standards and other regulations. The late 20th century also saw growing recognition of Colorado's multicultural heritage. The state's history wasn't just about Anglo pioneers and miners, but also about Mexican-American communities that had been present since Spanish colonial times. Native American peoples maintaining connections to their ancestral lands despite displacement. African-American cowboys and miners whose contributions had often been overlooked. Chinese laborers who built railroads and worked mines. Japanese-American farmers. And countless immigrant communities that had shaped Colorado's development. Historic preservation efforts saved important sites and buildings from destruction. Molly Brown's house in Denver, home of the Titanic survivor and social activist, became a museum. Ghost towns were stabilized rather than allowed to collapse completely. Mesa Verde and other archaeological sites received better protection and interpretation. Museums and cultural centers told more complete, more honest stories about Colorado's past, acknowledging difficult chapters like Sand Creek and Ludlow alongside the tales of triumph and achievement. Sports became an important part of Colorado's identity. The Denver Broncos, the state's NFL team, inspired fierce loyalty and civic pride, particularly during the team's Super Bowl victories in the late 1990s. The Colorado Rockies baseball team, playing in beautiful Coors Field in downtown Denver, attracted millions of fans. The Colorado Avalanche hockey team brought Stanley Cup championships. Professional sports franchises helped establish Denver as a major league city in more ways than one. The opening of Denver International Airport in 1995 marked a significant milestone. The airport, located far from the city on the plains to the northeast, was massive, designed to serve as a hub connecting the nation. Its iconic white tinsel roof, suggesting either tents or snow-capped peaks, depending on interpretation, became instantly recognizable. The airport, despite early problems with its automated baggage system, established Denver as a major transportation center. As the 21st century began, Colorado faced both opportunities and challenges. The tech boom of the late 1990s brought prosperity to the Front Range, attracting companies and workers from Silicon Valley and other tech centers. But the bust that followed in the early 2000s caused pain as well, with layoffs and business failures. The September 11th attacks affected Colorado's military installations and aerospace industries, while also dampening tourism temporarily. Two tragic shootings marked Colorado in ways that reverberated nationally. The Columbine High School massacre in 1999 shocked the nation as two students killed 12 classmates and a teacher before taking their own lives. The attacks sparked intense debates about gun control, school safety, bullying, and violence in media. Then in 2012, a gunman opened fire in a movie theater in Aurora, killing 12 people and wounding dozens more. These tragedies brought Colorado unwanted national attention and sparked ongoing conversations about violence, mental health, and community safety. Yet through these difficulties, Colorado continued to grow and evolve. The state's economy proved resilient, bouncing back from recessions more quickly than many other states. Denver's downtown continued its renaissance, with new residential towers bringing people back to the urban core. The light rail system expanded, connecting suburbs to downtown and to the airport. Offering an alternative to automobile dependency, Colorado's political landscape shifted in interesting ways. Once a reliably Republican state, Colorado became increasingly competitive, and then in the 2000s and 2010s, tilted toward Democrats, at least in statewide elections. This shift reflected demographic changes: younger, more educated, more diverse populations moving to the state, often bringing more progressive political views. Rural areas remained largely conservative, creating the familiar pattern of a divided state: cities and ski towns voting Democratic, rural and exurban areas voting Republican. In 2012, Colorado made national news by voting to legalize recreational marijuana, becoming one of the first states to do so. This controversial decision reflected Colorado's libertarian streak, the sense that government shouldn't dictate personal choices, and also pragmatic arguments about tax revenue and reducing criminal justice costs. The implementation of legal marijuana sales in 2014 made Colorado a laboratory for drug policy reform, with other states and nations watching closely to see how the experiment played out. The marijuana industry brought both benefits and challenges. Tax revenues exceeded expectations, funding school, construction, and other programs. Tourism increased as marijuana tourists visited to legally purchase what remained illegal in their home states. But concerns arose about underage use, drug-impaired driving, and the federal-state law conflicts. Since marijuana remained illegal under federal law, communities debated whether to allow marijuana businesses, with some embracing the industry and others banning it entirely. Climate change became an increasingly urgent concern in Colorado. The state's snowpack, crucial for water supply, showed troubling trends. Less snow falling, earlier melt times, longer fire seasons, mountain pine beetles, no longer controlled by severe winter cold snaps that had historically limited their populations, devastated millions of acres of forests, leaving dead trees that became fuel for catastrophic wildfires. Wildfires became more frequent and more severe. The Hayman Fire in 2002, the Waldo Canyon Fire in 2012, the Black Forest Fire in 2013, and many others destroyed hundreds of homes and burned hundreds of thousands of acres. Fire seasons extended from a few summer months to nearly year-round threats. Communities in the wildland of an interface, where houses meet forest, faced difficult questions about how to reduce fire risk while preserving the mountain lifestyle that attracted people to these areas. Water scarcity concerns intensified during prolonged droughts. The Colorado River, already overallocated with more water promised to various users than actually flows in the river in many years, faced additional stress. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, massive reservoirs on the river, dropped to historic lows. Cities and farms across the West, all depending on the Colorado River, faced the prospect of mandatory cutbacks. Yet, Colorado also led in addressing climate challenges. The state committed to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Renewable energy expanded rapidly, wind and solar becoming increasingly cost-competitive with fossil fuels. Electric vehicle adoption grew faster than national averages. Cities and towns adopted ambitious climate action plans. Whether these efforts would be sufficient remained uncertain. But Colorado was trying to be part of the solution, rather than just experiencing the problem. The COVID pandemic of 2020 and 2021 affected Colorado, as it did everywhere. Ski resorts closed mid-season, a shock to an industry that drives much of the mountain economy. Restaurants, theaters, and businesses shut down or operated under severe restrictions. Schools moved to remote learning. Coloradans, like people everywhere, experienced isolation, economic uncertainty, and loss. The pandemic highlighted both the fragility of modern life and the resilience of communities that found ways to support each other through crisis. The pandemic also accelerated some trends that were already emerging. Remote work became common, allowing people to live in Colorado while working for companies based elsewhere. This flexibility contributed to a new surge in population growth, particularly in mountain communities that had previously been weekend and vacation destinations, but now became full-time residencies. Real estate prices soared, raising concerns about affordability and community character. Throughout all these changes, Colorado maintained its distinctive character, a blend of Old West heritage and modern sophistication, of conservative and progressive values, of urban and rural perspectives. The cowboy and the software engineer, the rancher and the environmental activist, the ski instructor and the aerospace engineer, all are authentic parts of contemporary Colorado. The state's Native American communities, though much reduced and confined to reservations far smaller than their original territories, maintained their presence and cultures. The Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute tribes in southwestern Colorado developed successful gaming operations that provided economic benefits for their members. They also worked to preserve their languages and traditions, passing them to new generations, despite the enormous pressures of assimilation and the traumas of historical dispossession. Colorado's Hispanic communities, present since Spanish colonial times, remained vital parts of the state's culture. In southern Colorado, particularly in the San Luis Valley and in cities like Pueblo and Trinidad, Hispanic culture and Spanish language remained strong. Hispanic Coloradans contributed to every aspect of state life, from agriculture and ranching to business, politics, education, and the arts. Yet, they also faced challenges, including discrimination, economic inequalities, and debates over immigration policy that sometimes targeted their communities unfairly. The state's agricultural sector, while employing far fewer people than in the past, remained important both economically and culturally. Cattle ranching continued on the eastern plains and in mountain valleys, maintaining traditions going back generations. Sheep ranching, once more prominent, persisted in some areas. Wheat, corn, hay, and other crops were grown on large farms using modern equipment and techniques. Specialty agriculture, including organic farming, wine grapes, and craft brewing ingredients, found niches in Colorado's diverse climate zones. Yet, agriculture faced pressures: water costs and availability, competition for land from development, difficulty attracting and retaining workers, volatile commodity prices, all made farming and ranching challenging. Young people often left rural communities for better opportunities in cities, raising questions about who would continue operating family farms and ranches. Some agricultural land was sold for development or conservation easements that preserved open space but ended productive agricultural use. Mining, the industry that had defined Colorado for so long, continued but was much diminished. Some mines still operated, producing molybdenum, gold, and other metals, but employment in mining was a tiny fraction of what it had been in the industry's heyday. Old mining sites remained as reminders of the past, some restored as tourist attractions, others standing empty, slowly returning to nature. Monuments to the boom and bust cycles that had shaped Colorado's history. The transition from an extractive economy based on mining, logging, and agriculture to a service economy based on tourism, technology, and professional services was largely complete by the early 21st century. This brought benefits: cleaner industries, higher incomes for many, but also costs. Service sector jobs often paid less and offered fewer benefits than traditional blue-collar work. Inequality increased, and some communities and individuals were left behind by economic changes. Colorado's identity in the 21st century reflects all these layers of history. The state markets itself as an outdoor recreation paradise, and millions of tourists visit annually to ski, hike, raft, and simply enjoy the scenery. But Colorado is also a place where people live and work, raise families, build communities, and grapple with the same challenges facing communities everywhere. How to grow responsibly. How to preserve what makes a place special, while adapting to change. How to balance competing interests and values. The state's politics continued to reflect these tensions. Debates over energy development, with conflicts between those who wanted more oil and gas extraction, and those who wanted to restrict or ban it in favor of renewables. Debates over growth and development, with some wanting to encourage more housing construction to improve affordability, while others worried about traffic, sprawl, and loss of character. Debates over education, funding, transportation investment, healthcare access, homelessness, and countless other issues that demonstrated that for all its natural beauty and prosperity, Colorado faced real challenges. Water rights remained contentious, as they had been for over a century. The state's complex water law, with its prior appropriation system and its interstate compacts allocating water among states, created a framework that sometimes seemed ill-suited to 21st century realities. Climate change, population growth, and changing values about environmental protection all put pressure on water management systems designed decades earlier. Yet, there were also reasons for optimism. Colorado's economy was diverse and dynamic. Its educational institutions, from major research universities to community colleges, provided opportunities and workforce development. The state's quality of life attracted talented people who contributed to innovation and entrepreneurship. Colorado repeatedly ranked highly in national surveys, measuring economic growth, entrepreneurship, health outcomes, and overall well-being. The state's natural heritage remained largely intact. Despite over 150 years of intensive development, Colorado still had millions of acres of wilderness, pristine mountain peaks, wild rivers, abundant wildlife, black bears, mountain lions, elk, bighorn sheep, and countless other species thrived in protected habitats. Efforts to reintroduce species that had been eliminated, including lynx and wolves, showed commitment to ecological restoration. Though these efforts sometimes sparked controversy, particularly among ranchers worried about predation on livestock, Colorado's cultural life flourished. Denver supported a symphony orchestra, opera company, theater companies, and world-class art museums. The Aspen Music Festival, the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, and numerous other events attracted performers and audiences from around the world. Film festivals, literary festivals, and countless community celebrations enriched cultural life. Every town, it seemed, had its festivals and traditions. From rodeos to music festivals to craft fairs, events that brought communities together and connected residents to their heritage and to each other. The state's architectural heritage reflected its history. Victorian buildings from mining boom times stood alongside modernist structures from the mid-20th century, and contemporary buildings pushing the boundaries of design. Preservation efforts saved historic buildings from demolition, recognizing that these structures told important stories and contributed to community character. At the same time, new architecture made its own statements, sometimes controversial, but often exciting and innovative. Looking back across Colorado's history, from those first Paleontologian hunters following mammoth herds across an Ice Age landscape to the contemporary state with its thriving cities and protected wilderness, the story is one of constant change, of adaptation, of peoples coming to this landscape and making it home. It's a story of achievement and tragedy, of dreams realized and dreams broken, of conflict and cooperation, of exploitation and preservation. The native peoples who lived here for thousands of years adapted repeatedly to changing conditions, developing sophisticated cultures and deep relationships with the land. The Spanish, who came seeking gold, left a lighter footprint than they intended, but still influenced the region's trajectory. The mountain men, who trapped beaver, lived free, but contributed to an industry that nearly eliminated a species. The miners who rushed here seeking fortune built an economy, but scarred landscapes and created boom-bust cycles. The farmers and ranchers who settled the plains and valleys created communities, but sometimes struggled against a harsh environment. The laborers who built the railroads and worked the mines endured hardship and sometimes fought for dignity and fair treatment. The entrepreneurs and business leaders who built industries created wealth, but sometimes at great social and environmental cost. Each generation of Coloradans inherited a landscape shaped by those who came before and made their own mark, for better or worse. Some decisions proved wise, preserving wilderness and establishing parks that future generations could enjoy. Other decisions had lasting negative consequences, pollution that would take decades to clean up, communities displaced, ecosystems damaged. Yet, through it all, Colorado endured and evolved, constantly reinventing itself while maintaining connections to its past. Today's Colorado is vastly different from the Colorado of a century ago, let alone the landscape that existed before European contact. Yet threads connect across time. The mountains that awed the first humans to see them still inspire wonder. The rivers that sustained ancient peoples still flow, though often diverted and dammed. The sense of possibility, of opportunity, of freedom that drew people to Colorado continues to attract new residents. The spirit of independence, of resilience, of determination that characterized earlier generations still defines Coloradans today. The challenges facing Colorado in the 21st century are significant. Climate change, water scarcity, rapid growth, economic inequality, political polarization, and many others. Yet, the state has faced challenges before and found ways forward. The people who make Colorado their home, diverse in background and perspective, but united by love of place, continue to seek solutions, to build communities, to create the next chapter in Colorado's long and fascinating story. As we reach the end of this journey through Colorado's history, from those ancient hunters following mammoth herds to the modern state navigating 21st century challenges, we can appreciate the remarkable arc of human experience this landscape has witnessed. Colorado's story is America's story in many ways. A tale of exploration and settlement, of conflict and cooperation, of exploitation and preservation, of constant change and enduring values. The mountains still stand as they have for millions of years, indifferent to human drama, yet central to human experience in this place. The plains still stretch eastward, though now crossed by highways rather than wagon trails. The rivers still flow, though managed and diverted to serve human needs. And people still come to Colorado, drawn by opportunity, by beauty, by the promise of a better life, continuing the pattern that has defined this place for thousands of years. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Colorado's past. The state's story continues to unfold, written each day by those who call it home, shaped by decisions made and actions taken, built on the foundation of all that came before. Colorado's future remains to be written, but its past, rich and complex, fascinating and sometimes troubling, provides context and lessons for the challenges and opportunities ahead. Rest well, and may Colorado's story continue to inspire and instruct for generations to come.